Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to interview Carey Kluckow, who is a good friend, student of several of our classes, and also a graduate of the teacher training program. And so as part of our series introducing our graduates, we're interviewing her. Welcome, Carey, and maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Hi, Florian. I trained originally in the States as a herbalist in the early 90s. I then went to Africa and worked as a practicing therapist there in Zimbabwe, then moved to England where I trained as a clinical aromatherapist. And I currently work kind of with all of those modalities. Primarily in palliative care, though I do a fair amount of work with trauma with the Ministry of Defence in England as well.
Great. So maybe before we jump in even further, so how do you incorporate aroma into, you said you're a clinical aromatherapist. How do you incorporate aroma into your therapy practice?
Well, depending on what clients, we really work with the AromaGnosis approach now, normally just with smelling rather than actual usage, though I do anoint, normally in groupings of 3, depending on what we're really working on. But I no longer work with sort of slathering people up with oil, or it's become ineffective, I feel. I feel like the more traumatized the world is, essential oils become too strong, like tinctures. So flower essences become much more powerful, and tinctures fall away a little bit more. And I feel the same with scent. I would rather people work with it smelling rather than actually using them all the time. I find that the changes are more profound and they're quicker as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think just the act of smelling, there's an intention setting. You mentioned anointing, which I personally love. And so it's this mindful act. And even if you're not consciously restating the intention every time, just having that smell, that action will trigger it and disrupt the sort of screensaver mode of the brain. Now, you mentioned the groups of 3, and I was curious about what you mean by that.
Well, I found sometimes you taught us the 9-point anoint, but when I'm working with a group of people, particularly people who are in trauma, sometimes it takes me too long to move around to do that. So I'll anoint 3 times. I'll kind of choose, depending on what we're focusing, what kind of, for lack of a better way of saying it, chakra areas we'll work with. Yeah. And then I'll just do a quicker anoint with less, really, rather than the full thing.
Yeah, and I think that works very well, and fitting it to your needs and individual needs is really good, because you don't want, the 9-point anoint was sort of hitting all the major points, but you can totally tailor it, just on the philtrum or the temples. So I like.
I'm going to try to keep it in groups of 3s. I guess it's it's the threefold thing. I do try and group them like that, so I won't allow them a single anoint. It's either the 3 or kind of the 9, the whole thing.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and I find it's much more effective. It's also less, you're not feeding into this taking all the time. You're starting to send out a different kind of energy, which is more around working with rather than using. I think there's a real difference there. And when people are anointing, they become more in the working with category and less about using and buying 39,000, 10 ml bottles, and storing them up for the rest of their lives and never working with them.
Yeah. Well, I like what you said, working with, because on the one hand, it reminds me of the fact that we're working in partnership with these living molecules that are the soul of the plant or a manifestation of the soul of the plant. And the working with also reminds me that it's really, it keeps the client in the empowered position instead of, saying, shut up and take your pills, which is what, us shrinks used to do. The client makes an active choice to say, I'm going to anoint, I'm going to smell the oil, and it's the sense of I have the choice, the sense of control and autonomy is maintained. So I really like how you're working with that.
Well, and that's the AromaGnosis approach, and that was the thing that was so amazing about being in New Mexico, was that there's this framework that you're given, but it was never about anything other than self-empowerment. Every time it became a broader question, one of you would hone it back to, yeah, but how does this work for you? What is that? And I think that that's a very unusual aspect to the training. It's not about empowering other people or empowering your practice, or it's about self-empowerment. And then that flows on from there. And I think that's quite unusual. Most trainings are a little bit more sacrosanct. You've got to do it this way and that's that. And so it's about perpetuating somebody else's dream or myth rather than making it your own, which I guess at the time was a little bit, I don't know what to do with it. But when you're allowed then to be creative and make it your own, it is a more empowered process, and it allows the people who you're then working with to come at it from that perspective as well. So they are in charge rather than me. It's that real hollow bone now. And as I become older, it's easier to be the hollow bone. And the process, the AromaGnosis process allows that so easily. It's a beautiful platform for that to happen. And scent embodies and makes people embodied, whether they want to or not.
Right. We can't avoid, like you can't say, oh, you smell this and I'm going to pretend I'm not smelling this. It's going to touch us. It can't but touch us.
Particularly something like labdanum, which I used on Thursday evening with a group of people. I've been doing a series called Yoga and Plants with a girl who works quite a bit with trauma as well, with Yoga Nidra. And so we were kind of just playing around a little bit. And so I themed the evening around labdanum. And the shift in the people in the room was extraordinary. And I felt that shift within myself. But it's quite something else to watch an entire room of people change visibly and very quickly. I find that quite amazing. It's an extraordinary thing to watch people come into themselves and so easily, with very little effort involved.
Yes.
We've been told we've got to work all the time rather than allowing.
Yeah, what you're saying is giving me goosebumps. It reminds me, having taught and worked with clients for a long time now, it's like, the aroma, the spirit enters the room, like in native tradition, sometimes they'll say the medicine, meaning whatever it is, prayer or plant, has entered the room. And when you see it reflected in everyone again and again and again, it's just, it's just really nice to see the plant spirit manifest like that.
Well, and it shows us literally how little we understand.
Yes. Yeah, we've got to get out of our own way.
Well, and I went to the mushroom conference recently, and you start to, we all have the saying, as above, so below. And I find that amusing now, because I realize the tree above is so small compared to what's below. Yes. So actually what we don't see is so much greater than what we see. And when you see these oils working in that way, you wonder how much we don't know. Yes. Because I can see people, everything changes about them. Not only the color in their face, but their demeanor, sometimes even the way they speak. you can watch people drop into themselves, sometimes almost instantly. And I mean, I've been seeing clients for, well, almost 3 decades now. So I have a fair amount of experience. I'm not sure that I've ever seen people change so profoundly, so quickly. Now, it has a lot to do with the quality and the energetics of the oils that are being used, obviously. But I think the other thing is that we are very traumatized, each and every one of us. And so the power of plants to heal that trauma is unparalleled. We don't understand it. We can learn more and more to work with these energetics. And some of the oils, particularly some of Kathy's oils, they're incredibly transformative, and particularly for traumatized people.
Well, to me, the essence of trauma, I mean, the word literally means cut or wound, and it's that sense of being cut off from our family, our loved ones, ourselves, and spirit, creation, the divine and nature. And for me, these molecules that fly through the air to communicate, that's why I call them molecules of connectedness. It's like they heal that sense of cut offness through their very nature. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, working with clients and working on yourself. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about how, you're using aromas or your own process, working on yourself, and how that's reflected in your work with your clients.
Well, I think it's everything. I think you can't effectively use a process unless you're doing it yourself. And the first class I had with you was in 2014. That was the beginning of your journey with all of this. And, well, it changed my life. I had suddenly you realize that there's an anatomy of the soul. You're not taught that there's an anatomy of your psyche. So as a very traumatized person, when I came to that class, that sudden understanding opened up a whole world of, I guess, a cognitive understanding of, okay, this is more than I knew and understood. Now there's a framework. Now that's easier. So the overwhelm starts to fall away. Then when you're working with oils and you get to know them well, and it's a long process, it takes time, like making friends, it takes energy and time, and you build these beautiful relationships, you are then able to work with clients at a much deeper level. And because you have it's a friendship, it's a very deep relationship with whichever plants you're using. And I don't use things in my practice that I haven't tried first. Mm-hmm. So I would never give anybody anything that I haven't personally worked with. And I think people want to heal. They want to feel loved and included. It's a human nature. We desperately seek to be included and connected. And essential oils do that. And so it's really easy to hand somebody a bottle and say to them, for the next week, 3 times a day, spend a minute, let the oil guide you, make a few notes, and let's see where you're at. And if I'm clever in my diagnosis, and if I'm the hollow bone and I'm able to listen to what's coming at me, I give people the right oils and they do the job together. I'm no longer a part of the whole thing. I have to be very integral with the way I work. Mm-hmm. And so that now means for me, and that's changed since the teacher training, I've always been very careful about who and where I buy oils from anyway, but that's become even more critical. Mm-hmm. We've got lots of multi-level marketing here, like you will in the States. And trying to steer people away from that's also become critically important, because we're feeding into the whole craziness. And essential oils have become a bit of a buzzword. And it's unfortunate because people think it's a go-to to fix everything. And they head into the shop and buy some adulterated something that then doesn't work. And then everything now no longer is a valid science. And so I think once again, it's about trying to reclaim the art and the science of it and embody people rather than the therapist being the one saying, you're going to do this, this is how you're going to do it, this is when you're going to do it. It's a more difficult journey to embody people.
Yes.
You've got to take yourself out of the equation. The narcissist can't be in the room. And when you're in a society, particularly with Brexit and the craziness going on here, you are in that all the time. So it's often very difficult to take that step back. Essential oils allow you to do that very easily. And the reality is that even the people that are not aware feel the overwhelm, because our world is not happy. You know, we are and not only people are unhappy, but the earth itself is not in a great place. And so whether we want to or not, we feel that. And overwhelm sends us into doing nothing. Essential oils crest that.
Yeah.
As do flower essences.
Yes.
Or now all the other essences. You guys have got the cactus ones now. I've been playing around with the mushroom essences. They are unbelievably powerful, and they shift things that you don't even know are an issue until you start taking them, and suddenly you say, oh, that's no longer the case. Wow. So they're unbelievably profound and gentle. We step away from that real sort of male archetype, that very aggressive, into something, I think, Rhiannon uses the terms Rambo and Mother Teresa. And I think, you know, there are Rambo essential oils and Mother Teresa essential oils, but the world is a bit Rambo at the moment. And so I think Mother Teresa is the counterpoint to that. Yeah. So you're talking about something like thyme versus rose geranium, you know, that there's a real difference to them. And whilst Rambo's needed sometimes, it's really not the status quo all the time, which is where we live. We live with Rambo all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's created a space where it's okay to go in and rape the Amazon, and because we're treating ourselves like that. So it doesn't mean anything to treat the earth like that as well.
Right.
So that dynamic's going to change.
Yeah, no, I mean, people are projecting their shadow onto nature, onto the feminine, and, you know, and it feeds this Rambo mentality. And, you know, there is a role for that, but it's gotten rampant and out of control. And that disconnection, I always feel like that disconnection is like what a cancer cell is to a human body. It's forgotten it's part of a bigger organism.
Yep.
And that's, you know, we're seeing that everywhere on all levels in every country of the world right now.
Absolutely.
Carey, can you tell me a little bit more about what your experience of teacher training was like, and sort of how it rippled through your work and life after or since you've done it?
Yeah, teacher training was amazing. The weaving of big landscape with the plants, with the deeper knowing of the levels of our psyche, gives you a lot of control over your own life, even when things are spiraling out of control all around you. The entire teacher training was all about self-empowerment. So I struggled a bit initially because I wanted a process that I could then take forward with me and teach. I should have known better, having done all of your courses. I really, you know, it's amazing how you can convince yourself of something. I struggled when I came back to work out how to make it work. And in fact, it upended everything. And since then, I've changed the way I work a lot. And it's become, everything's slowed down a bit. It's become easier. All of my relationships have deepened, not only with the plants, but with my clients, my friends. I kind of feel, I guess, in many ways that it gave me a platform to heal a lot of stuff. Some things that I didn't even realize needed healing. Big Landscape shows you that often. But then to come back and realize that a lot of the stuff that I was dealing with was my own projections, and that it was time to start reeling that stuff in, and that the AromaGnosis approach allowed me to start dealing with some of those things that are quite terrifying, particularly when you're on your own and there's nobody around to visibly support you. And that process, I mean, it's been just over a year now since our training. And the last year I've used the process religiously. I take an hour every day and I work with something. And I've seen it ripple out to my clients. It's extraordinary. I've had a number of clients that have been with me for a decade who have some serious mental health issues. And in the last 3 months, I almost don't see them anymore. So instead of me treating them, I've given them a method to empower themselves, and they're now treating themselves. So both with oils, but also with essences. So you've created just a few for each person that they can go to, so that they are deciding when they need to take something. And I think that you and Kathy, that was what you allowed me to do, to finally accept and understand that actually it wasn't about me. And that whilst I was a wounded healer, I wasn't going to be the wounded wounder. And that meant that I really did need to do the work. And I think the things that I was most afraid of were easily dealt with plant allies. Powerful plant allies. You can't really walk into the local Holland and Barrett, which is our kind of mass health food store, and buy an essential oil and head out and expect that that's going to be the case, because you have to have the green spirit that comes all the way through.
Yes.
That's really critical, and I think people underestimate how powerful that is. We know a good product when we see it. I think most people do. They try something and they think, oh yeah, that's better than that. Mm-hmm. And I think when you give them a superior product, they absolutely understand. And then when you now move on to a very green and the real essence of the plant, it can't help but heal people. And if you can empower them as well, if they can understand that their psyche has an anatomy, we all go through it. So once again, you're stopping that disconnection. Because I think very often when we're in the heat of some of these more difficult emotions, we are the only one. It's very difficult to suddenly go, oh yeah, but everybody experiences this. I mean, I say to people, everybody's traumatized. And I'll have people say to me, I've never had anything happen to me that's traumatized. And I'm like, wow. Then why do we see these behaviors from you? Because these are trauma behaviors. I think people don't realize we're living on a traumatized planet. And of course we're traumatized. That doesn't mean we haven't, you don't have to be raped or people trafficked, or we've all got it.
Absolutely. And I think that's sort of, there are layers of defense mechanisms with trauma. And one of them is sort of like, I'm okay, take care of everybody else first. Even if there is a real trauma, and we'll often, automatically, unconsciously try to blot out the memories. And people say, oh, I have no trauma. And then they'll smell an oil like that, and then all of a sudden remember all these traumatic experiences that happen. And often we what is trauma is already like a slippery slope. And one of the hallmarks is that sense of helplessness. But a lot of people have been traumatized and don't even know they've been traumatized because they're so traumatized repeatedly that it's normal. Like there was no normal before, and then the trauma happened. The trauma was there all the way through. They're not wearing rose-colored glasses. They're wearing trauma-colored glasses.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then now we live in this. I mean, I come from Africa, which is a colony, so we've got collective trauma constantly.
Yes.
So I think it's in all of our lineages anyway, particularly us of European descent.
Yes.
And so now you're dealing with a collective trauma as well, which you can feel in rooms. You go to, any of the concentration camps, you can feel it in the very earth, that there's a collective trauma attached. I know in Africa, we've been into the slave pits there. And I mean, the earth holds the very memory of it. You can sense it. Even people who are not aware, you can see them step into that place and there's a change. Because the land itself is traumatized.
Now, it reminds me of years ago when people would say, oh, your patients must be so different and difficult, with the classic psychiatric patients. I said the only difference between my patients, and I don't even use that word anymore, and people walking down the street is my patients are honest. We've all got something, quote, wrong with us. We're all traumatized, but the people who, would see me or people like us, they're willing to work on it instead of pretending there's nothing to see. And I think that pretending there's nothing actually re-traumatizes it. We see that in individuals where a girl gets molested, tells the parents said, shut up, that never happened. When we were in Austria, I heard that where, people would find out they had Jewish ancestors and then the whole family would say, that's not true, that never happened. So there's this cognitive discrepancy. That's often where the trauma really happens. If a traumatic experience happens and there's a community or group process to heal it, process it, talk about it, it doesn't turn into that long-term trauma. But pretending it didn't happen inevitably creates the trauma. But then part of the trauma is saying, well, it wasn't traumatic, it didn't happen.
Well, that's one of the things with the teacher training as well, was that what you absolutely had, which was created almost instantly, which is interesting when there's a group of people who nobody knows each other, was this very, very sacred, safe space. Mm-hmm. So for everybody, there was this ability to really experience themselves, which is unusual, I think, in trainings. And that very safe place, as well as landscape, as well as the plants, allowed people to, explore themselves. I'm not sure how often we're allowed to do that in our society. And so now when you have a space when it's literally held safe by you and Kathy so that we can explore and experience ourselves with a kind of backup there of help if needed, you can get through a lot of crap. You can actually clear a lot of debris and walk out the other side. And I remember getting on the plane on the way back and sort of thinking, I can't believe how much I'm leaving behind. How many circles have closed? I knew that I was going to close one, going back to New Mexico. But when I actually sat on the plane, I sort of thought, there are so many things that have now been healed on so many levels, which was so unexpected. That wasn't what I was expecting. So whilst it's a teacher training and you learn lots of things, it's really like a personal mini, I don't want to say retreat because it's a terrible word,
yes,
but
I agree.
There's a mini life break where you get to reassess and come at everything from this really beautiful embodied new place. And that ripples out to everybody around you. And I've seen lots of changes since I came back from the teacher training in my own personal house, as well as in the practice and in work. It's extraordinary. And I do think the more empowered each one of us becomes, the more bold we become. We've been told we're small and meaningless. I think when we realize that we're actually unbelievably big and powerful, we get to make some real changes that actually have some real positive consequences for life, the universe, and everybody.
Absolutely. And I think that working on it, you know, it's easy. We mentioned that overwhelm early in the conversation, and it's easy to get overwhelmed when we say, oh, what can little powerless me do with all this out there? But we can always work on ourselves, and that's what ripples out, like you're saying. And you've mentioned several times already the community. And one thing that I really cherish about the teacher training is, you know, even though we're all over the world, really, you know, there is still that sense of community. And yeah, there are days when we feel we're alone, but we know we're connected somehow. And that, I think, is that sense of like a rhizomic or a connection,
Yes.
or like a mycelia.
Yeah, it's the mycorrhizal zone, absolutely.
It's a spiritual mycorrhizome.
Yeah, and I think it's growing. And I mean, what I see is that, you know, in the group that did the teacher training, a lot of us are doing some pretty extraordinary things. That's happened in the last year.
Yes.
So it's amazing how much can shift and change. And a lot of the choices I've made in the last year have gone against the grain, and people have said, but why would you do that? But the outcome at the end of the day is not only a happier me, but a happier planet as well.
Yes.
So I think the teacher training is kind of one of those, I have some must-read books. I always tell people you can't go through life without reading certain books. I feel that way a bit about the teacher training. When I came back, I thought everybody should have to experience themselves in that way, because you get to the beauty of who you are rather than all of this other stuff that we're told or that we take on.
Yes.
You get to strip away to that bare beauty that you are, that, you know, that creation. And the teacher training is beautiful for that. And then incorporating it into your own modality, I think, is probably a whole lifelong journey.
Yes. Well, thank you for everything you've said, Carey. Everything you've said, like I can't think of any more questions to ask you. Are there any observations, reflections, anything else you want to share sort of as a final reflection?
No, other than, you know, I think the work that you guys are doing and the ripple effects from it are huge. And the more people that can work like we now do, the more we can shift consciousness to being in a much better place. There's so many beautiful people out there. To try and be a little bit more like that and a little bit less like the crazy.
Yeah. It's like
to bring hope back. And again, hope's not one of my favorite words, but, you know, it's another one of those things where we can't live in this disconnected overwhelm. We have to come from this place of love and heart and, yeah, withdrawing our shadows. You know, that's that young quote which you told me, which has been up on my wall. And I mean, it's not easy work, but it's work that has to happen if we want to see a change on the planet.
Absolutely.
And I think we're at a crux point where we have no choice now. Either we have no planet very shortly, or we make those changes. And some of the processes that you teach enable people to make those very difficult changes unbelievably easily, actually, once you get into the work. And it allows that deep fear that stops us from doing so many things is plants somehow melt that away. I don't understand how it works, and I'm not sure that you need to understand it. What I do know is it does work. And so I think the more people that can work with plants respectfully, the more we'll start to see that.
Well, thank you so much, Carey. I really appreciate this. Let me pause the recording.